For far too long, anxious individuals have been misunderstood, labeled as fragile, dysfunctional, or even problematic. Popular culture reinforces the myth that a restless mind is the enemy of peace, that overthinking is a sign of emotional weakness, and that the solution is simple: just stop worrying. But what happens when we look deeper, through the lens of cognitive science, deep psychology, and neuroscience? Could it be that anxiety, rather than a flaw, is actually the reflection of a brain operating at an unusually high level of complexity? The truth is, there exists a particular kind of anxious mind, one that isn't merely reacting to fear, but is actively engaged in intense cognitive processing, a mind that constantly simulates scenarios, anticipates threats, and evaluates variables that most people never even consider. And perhaps, as counterintuitive as it may seem, this kind of mind is actually better equipped to handle the demands of the modern world than we've been led to believe. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman introduced a theory that radically shifts how we interpret this phenomenon. In his groundbreaking book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, Kahneman describes two systems of thought that operate in our brains. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. System 2 is slow, analytical, and deliberate. People with high levels of anxiety often live with System 2 constantly activated, meaning their minds are perpetually evaluating possibilities, questioning assumptions, and anticipating what could go wrong. In other words, they are thinking excessively, thinking deeply. And that brings us to the central provocation of this video. What if these people, the so-called overthinkers, the restless, the ones tormented by their own thoughts, are actually operating at a cognitive level that most never reach? What if this intense form of thinking, when properly channeled, represents an evolutionary, intellectual, and strategic advantage? This video is not just about anxiety. It's about a type of mind that refuses easy answers. A mind that examines every decision, questions every step, and detects what others miss. It's about the genius hidden inside mental chaos. And at the same time, it's a warning, because when this cognitive power goes unregulated, it ceases to be an asset and becomes an unbearable burden. Throughout this video, we're going to explore how anxiety can be a manifestation of high-level analytical thinking, when it crosses the line into psychological risk, and, most importantly, how to channel this intense mental activity into something functional, productive, and ultimately human. If you see yourself as someone who thinks too much, who worries constantly, who feels the weight of the world pressing down on your shoulders, this video might not only explain why that happens, but show you how to transform that so-called flaw into one of your greatest strengths. For most of history, the anxious mind has been misunderstood. Ancient societies often labeled it as weakness. Modern medicine rushed to pathologize it. And even today, corporate culture idolizes the decisive, the fast, the confident. Everything a chronically anxious thinker seems not to be. But when viewed through the lens of evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, a new question emerges. What if the anxious brain isn't broken? What if it's a form of cognitive vigilance shaped for survival in a complex world? Daniel Kahneman's theory of the two-system brain reframes anxiety not merely as emotional turbulence, but as the hyperactivation of a specific cognitive process. In his framework, System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive. It's the system that helps us recognize faces, avoid danger instantly, or make snap judgments. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, effortful. It's the part of the brain responsible for weighing pros and cons, simulating future scenarios, identifying errors in logic. It doesn't react, it reflects. And this is where anxious individuals diverge from the norm. In a world that mostly operates on the quick instincts of System 1, Anxious minds live predominantly in System 2. They don't just see what is, they see what could be. While others make decisions on impulse, the anxious thinker is already 5 moves ahead, analyzing outcomes, running mental simulations, questioning every variable. It's exhausting. But it's also a form of mental precision that most people never develop. This isn't mere speculation. Kahneman's decades of research showed that anxious individuals often avoid the cognitive traps that plague fast thinkers, like overconfidence, confirmation bias, anchoring bias, and sunk cost fallacies. These biases distort our perception of reality and lead to poor decisions. The anxious mind, by its nature, resists them. Why? Because it doesn't trust its first instinct. It questions everything, especially itself. Think about that. In a society that rewards certainty, anxious thinkers are punished for doubt. But that very doubt is what protects them from dangerous errors in high-stakes environments. In medicine, finance, engineering, crisis management, where a single wrong decision can have catastrophic consequences, the overthinker may not only survive, but outperform. Not because they're fearless, but because they feel the fear, analyze the risk, and act with intentionality. It's a paradox. The same trait that causes indecision, paralysis, and rumination in daily life can become a razor-sharp tool in contexts where others crumble under pressure. The anxious brain is a threat detector, a pattern recognizer, a risk mitigator. In evolutionary terms, it's not hard to imagine how such a brain would have kept early humans alive, anticipating danger before it struck, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, preparing for outcomes others never considered. But this advantage comes with a cost. The brain that's wired to constantly scan for threats doesn't shut off just because the environment is safe. In the modern world, where our physical survival is less threatened but cognitive complexity has exploded, the anxious mind often turns inward. It begins scanning the self, the future, the imagined. And without a structured framework to channel this vigilance, that same brilliant mind can collapse under its own weight. This brings us to a critical crossroads. When does anxious thinking serve you, and when does it begin to destroy you? The answer lies not in suppressing your anxiety, but in learning to calibrate it. To know when to trust your analytical mind and when to let go. In the next section, we'll dive into real-world examples of how anxious thinkers outperform intuitive decision-makers in complex, high-stakes environments, and how the very mechanisms that cause suffering can, in the right context, become tools of mastery. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. In everyday life, overthinking is usually treated as a flaw. It's mocked in casual conversation, pathologized in clinical diagnoses, and minimized by the oversimplified self-help industry that insists we should just stop worrying. But what if overthinking, in the right environment, is not a bug, but a feature? What if the very tendency that causes sleepless nights and mental exhaustion is precisely what makes certain people excel in roles where others fail? Daniel Kahneman's research offers a sobering truth. Most people, even highly intelligent, educated professionals, make poor decisions when stakes are high. Why? Because they rely on System 1. They make decisions based on intuition, gut feelings, and mental shortcuts known as heuristics. And these shortcuts, while useful for navigating routine choices, collapse in the face of complexity. This is where the anxious thinker thrives. Unlike System 1 thinkers, the anxious brain distrusts simplicity. It doesn't assume, it investigates. It doesn't leap, it calculates. When confronted with a major decision, the anxious mind does what others are unwilling or unable to do. It slows down. It interrogates assumptions, it anticipates failure, it demands evidence, and it continues doing this long after others have already acted. This cognitive style may be painful in daily life, but in domains like finance, medicine, and engineering, it's exactly the kind of thinking that prevents disaster. Take the example of risk assessment in the financial sector. Most investors fall prey to the illusion of control, believing their models and intuitions are enough to forecast unpredictable markets. But Kahneman showed that markets punish overconfidence and reward caution. An anxious analyst, one who constantly questions their own assumptions, who considers improbable worst-case scenarios, who double-checks every data point, is less likely to fall for the seductive but fatal illusion of certainty. That overthinking may not earn praise in casual conversation, but it's exactly what avoids billion-dollar catastrophes. The same applies to medicine. A doctor who rushes to a diagnosis based on the first few symptoms is relying on pattern recognition. System 1. But a physician who slows down, who doubts their initial impressions, who asks, "What am I missing?" That's System 2 in action. And while patients may not see the mental effort behind this process, it's often what separates a misdiagnosis from a life-saving intervention. In engineering, aviation, nuclear energy, fields where a single error can cause massive destruction, protocols are often designed to force System 2 thinking. Checklists, redundancy, simulations. These are not signs of distrust in professionals. They're acknowledgements that the human brain, when left on autopilot, is prone to catastrophic error. Ironically, the anxious mind already behaves as if it were in one of these high-risk environments, scanning, preparing, doubting, verifying, even when it doesn't have to. This is the hidden genius of anxiety. It compels due diligence. It resists shortcuts. It delays action, not out of weakness, but because it understands, often unconsciously, that complexity demands respect. But here's the danger. The anxious mind doesn't come with an internal switch. It doesn't automatically know when to engage in deep analysis and when to let things go. That's why many anxious people find themselves paralyzed by trivial choices. What to eat, what to wear, which email to send first. The same system that prevents fatal errors in surgery or financial collapse is also what keeps someone stuck in indecision over a meaningless detail. So the key isn't to silence the anxious mind. It's to train it, to teach it when its overthinking is an asset and when it's an anchor, to recognize the difference between complexity and triviality, and to respond accordingly. In the next section, we'll explore where this line is drawn and how anxious thinkers can learn to distinguish between useful analysis and self-destructive rumination. Because the difference between a cognitive advantage and a psychological burden often comes down to one simple thing: regulation. There's a fine line between brilliance and breakdown. The very mind that can foresee a dozen catastrophic outcomes in a boardroom can also spiral at 2 a.m. over a text that wasn't answered. The same brain that navigates life or death decisions in high-risk environments can become paralyzed by choosing between oat milk and almond milk in the grocery store. This is the paradox of the anxious thinker. The cognitive machinery is powerful, but without regulation, it turns inward, implodes, and corrodes the self from the inside out. Kahneman never romanticized anxiety. He understood its dual nature, its capacity to act as a cognitive firewall against mistakes, and its potential to become a psychological prison when untamed. When System 2, the deliberate analytical part of the brain, becomes hyperactive and unrelenting, it doesn't just slow down decision-making, it shatters it. What was once caution becomes paralysis. What was once insight becomes obsession. The overanalyzing doesn't end with better choices. It ends with no choice at all. An anxious mind in balance is a strategic asset. An anxious mind in overdrive is a self-contained battlefield. At its most dangerous, this internal war detaches a person from reality. You start rethinking conversations days after they happened, mentally replaying every facial expression, every tone of voice, searching for threats that aren't there. You interpret silence as rejection, uncertainty as danger, and harmless decisions as ticking time bombs. You create worst-case scenarios not to prepare for them, but because your brain no longer knows how to stop. This is not high-level thinking anymore. This is cognitive exhaustion. Kahneman identified the signals. When your anxiety persists, even after you've taken all necessary preparatory actions. When it no longer serves to help, but only to punish. When it doesn't drive problem-solving, but triggers avoidance. When it starts to hijack your functioning, socially, emotionally, professionally. That's not your analytical mind doing its job. That's your nervous system screaming for help. And here lies the distinction between functional anxious thinking and clinical anxiety. Preparation versus paralysis. When the mental simulations you run help you adapt, anticipate, and act, anxiety is working for you. When those same simulations trap you in rumination, hesitation, and self-doubt, anxiety is working against you. Unfortunately, many don't realize they've crossed that line. They continue to believe their suffering is a sign of intelligence, that their torment is just the price of being a deep thinker. But wisdom demands more than just complexity. It requires clarity. And sometimes, clarity begins with admitting, this is no longer sustainable. There is no shame in reaching that point. The most brilliant minds break under their own weight when their inner systems go unregulated. Therapy, medication, structured cognitive interventions, these are not admissions of weakness. They are tools for recalibration, tools for restoring the nervous system to a state where deep thought can once again serve rather than sabotage. Understanding this threshold is essential, because in the next section, we won't just discuss why this happens, we'll explore how to manage it. Through strategies rooted in Kahneman's own work, we'll look at how to redirect your anxious cognition into structured, useful channels before it consumes you. If there's one truth anxious thinkers need to hear, it's this. Your mind is not the enemy. Your lack of a system is. The pain of anxiety doesn't come solely from thinking too much. It comes from thinking without direction, without containment, without structure. When your brain is running simulations with no end, scanning for threats without distinction, and generating problems faster than you can solve them, that's not intelligence. That's entropy. And entropy, left unchecked, destroys even the sharpest minds. Daniel Kahneman understood this, which is why his most powerful contributions weren't just theories, they were tools. Practical methods for channeling the raw processing power of System 2 into action instead of anxiety. Let's look at three of the most potent. The first is what Kahneman calls the pre-mortem technique, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Before making a critical decision, you imagine it has already failed, not because you're being pessimistic, but because you want to understand why. You force yourself to walk through the wreckage of a hypothetical failure and analyze its causes in reverse. What went wrong? What did I overlook? What assumptions collapsed under pressure? For the anxious mind, this is not only natural, it's empowering. You're already imagining failure. The pre-mortem gives that mental habit a purpose. It transforms vague worry into structured analysis. Instead of being trapped in a fog of what-ifs, you begin to extract insight from your fears, and that insight informs smarter decisions. The second tool is the high-stakes filter. One of the core problems anxious people face is not knowing where to aim their mental energy. They treat every decision, from choosing a career path to picking a restaurant, with the same level of seriousness. This creates exhaustion and indecision in low-impact areas of life where overthinking adds zero value. Kahneman's solution? Calibrate your attention based on stakes. Ask yourself, what's the long-term consequence of this decision? If the answer is negligible, then stop treating it like it's life or death. Let System 1 handle it. Go with your gut. Save the heavy machinery of analysis for decisions that genuinely matter. Finances, health, relationships, ethical dilemmas. The more you practice this, the more you protect your cognitive resources from burnout. Finally, we have the principle of satisficing, a term coined by Herbert Simon, but deeply aligned with Kahneman's philosophy. Satisficing is the art of choosing the good enough option instead of the perfect one. This is a direct antidote to perfectionistic anxiety, the idea that unless you make the absolute best decision, you've failed. In reality, optimization comes at a steep mental cost. The more options you analyze, the more regret you risk. The more you seek perfection, the more likely you are to delay or avoid action altogether. Satisficing trains you to prioritize movement over maximization. You ask, is this option acceptable? Will it meet my needs? Will it move me forward? If the answer is yes, you decide, and you move on. Now, none of these strategies are about eliminating anxiety. That's not the goal, and it's not possible. What they do is give your anxiety a job. They convert your mental energy from threat scanning into risk management, from emotional paralysis into structured thought, from spiraling fear into forward momentum. But there's one more dimension we need to address, perhaps the most important one, because no matter how many tools you use, there's a point at which anxiety stops being a strategy and becomes a signal that something deeper is misaligned, and that cognitive restructuring alone may not be enough. In the next section, we'll confront that reality head-on. We'll talk about the red flags, the unmistakable signs that your anxiety has crossed the line into something clinical. And more importantly, what you must do when your own mind becomes unsafe territory. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There comes a point where thinking, no matter how structured or strategic, turns into suffering. A point where the mind no longer serves the individual but punishes them. And for many anxious thinkers, especially those who've been told all their lives to just calm down or stop worrying so much, this shift happens quietly, invisibly, until one day they wake up unable to function. The genius has turned into a burden, the sharpness into a torment. This is the transition from high-functioning anxious cognition into clinical anxiety, and it is critical to recognize. Daniel Kahneman's framework helps us understand how this transformation occurs. System 2, when overengaged without rest or containment, begins to erode itself. The very system that once protected you from bad decisions now becomes the source of endless doubt, self-criticism, and paralysis. And unlike System 1, which runs automatically in the background, System 2 requires energy, focus, mental bandwidth. So when it never shuts off, the result is predictable: exhaustion, depression, cognitive fog, emotional volatility. But how do you know you've crossed that line? Kahneman offered indirect clues, signals that your anxious thinking is no longer rational analysis, but a malfunctioning process. The first is persistence without purpose. If you've already taken all the necessary precautions, prepared for the meeting, triple-checked your work, made the safest decision, and your anxiety still won't let go, that's not vigilance, that's dysregulation. Second, inhibition over action. Functional anxiety helps you prepare and perform. Disordered anxiety traps you in avoidance. You cancel plans, procrastinate on decisions, isolate yourself. Not because you're unsure, but because your brain convinces you that the safest choice is to do nothing. You start seeing every option as a threat, every path as a trap. Third, disproportionate emotional intensity. A small mistake spirals into shame. A delayed text turns into heartbreak. A look from a stranger becomes a rejection. The brain begins to lose its ability to scale emotion to the reality of the situation. You're no longer responding to the world. You're responding to your interpretation of it, which has been hijacked by fear. Fourth, functional impairment. You stop sleeping. Your relationships suffer. You can't concentrate. You feel detached from your body, from time, from reality itself. You begin to dread everyday tasks, not because they're difficult, but because your internal world has become so loud, so overwhelming, that even brushing your teeth feels like a mountain. And finally, suffering without growth. The mark of functional anxiety is that it drives something. Better performance, more preparation, sharper thinking. But disordered anxiety offers no return on investment. It drains, punishes, and traps you in cycles of thought that solve nothing. This is where psychological wisdom must step in. If you're seeing yourself in these patterns, you are not too sensitive, too weak, or too broken. You are experiencing the collapse of a cognitive system that has been overextended beyond its limits. And just like an overworked muscle, a flooded engine, or a cracked foundation, it needs help, not judgment. This is where therapy becomes essential, not as a luxury, but as a lifeline. Not to make you less intelligent or less sensitive, but to recalibrate your systems so that your intelligence and sensitivity can work for you again. Cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic approaches, medication. These are not admissions of defeat. They are instruments of restoration. They help bring System 2 back into balance. They help you reconnect with your body, your breath, your instincts. They help you learn when to let go. So no, anxiety does not make you broken, but refusing to address it when it becomes unmanageable does. There is no honor in drowning quietly. But here's the good news. Once you learn to recognize your own thresholds, once you seek help when necessary, you begin to reclaim your mind. And from that place of clarity, you can finally make a deeper shift. One that isn't about fighting your anxious thoughts, but about training them. About learning when to engage, when to let go, and how to build a relationship with your own mind that is based not in fear, but in wisdom. And that's exactly what we'll uncover in the final part of this journey, the art of recalibration. How to live with a powerful, anxious mind without being consumed by it. To live with an anxious mind is to inhabit a paradox. You are constantly forecasting threats, scanning every possible outcome, mentally rehearsing every scenario. While the world around you moves forward, seemingly unbothered, you feel everything deeper, you question more, you prepare more. But at what cost? The truth is, anxiety isn't something you eliminate, it's something you calibrate. And when you learn to do that, your anxious mind doesn't make you weaker. It makes you more precise, more prepared, more attuned to complexity that others overlook. The key is to build a system around your sensitivity, not in spite of it. This means learning to notice when your thoughts are useful and when they're just noise. You begin asking better questions. Is this fear protecting me or paralyzing me? Is this analysis generating clarity or confusion? The anxious mind often fixates on solving everything, but maturity is realizing that not everything deserves to be solved. That's when power returns. Not when you stop thinking, but when you stop obeying every thought. When you can step back from the spiral, when you can say, "This doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be enough." That's not surrender, that's control. And maybe, just maybe, your anxiety isn't a malfunction. It's a signal, not of weakness, but of depth, not of fragility, but of a mind tuned to frequencies others can't hear. You are not here to shut that mind down. You are here to sharpen it, to learn when to trust it, when to challenge it, and when to let it rest. So ask yourself this: is your anxiety guiding you, or is it running you into the ground? If you've seen yourself in this video, if the patterns I've described feel painfully familiar, it's time to do something most people never dare. Turn inward, not to fight your mind, but to understand it. And from that understanding, to finally lead it. Leave a comment below and tell me, how does your mind operate when no one's watching? Do you feel like it's your greatest strength or your greatest enemy? I want to hear your story. And don't stop here. The next video is already waiting for you, and trust me, it's not just important, it's necessary. You've opened a door, now walk through it.